Although preschoolers don't grow at the rapid rate that infants and toddlers do, they still grow pretty quickly. So you can see that preschool age children, or children aged 3 to 5, should grow about 2 to 3 inches per year and gain about 5 to 7 pounds per year. So you can see that during the 3rd year, we expect roughly for them to gain about 5 pounds and grow about 3.5 inches. And then in their 5th year, we expect them to gain about 4.5 pounds and grow about 2.5 inches. So even beyond that, so there's that rapid growth that we're not really going to see again until kids get to the teen years. The body changes a lot during the preschool period. So that toddler who's kind of round and short-limbed and has a sway back and a little pot belly is going to give way to a preschooler who looks much more adult-like in their proportions. So their torso should lengthen out, they should have a straighter spine, so not so much of that sway back. The limbs start to grow more, so they should have a longer legged and arm look to them. So much more big kid, adult-like in their proportions, kind of growing out of that kind of toddler appearance. So to make sure that children are growing well, doctors will take stock every year when children come for their yearly checkups, and they will use a growth chart. So they will measure how children are growing in terms of their height and their weight, and see if they are on track in terms of their physical growth and development in the way that they need to be. So I would encourage you to take a look at the kidshealth.org article on this slide. It will give you more information about growth charts. And then on the next slide, slide 4, it gives you a little quiz to make sure that you understand or understood the material on that kidshealth.org page correctly. So I've tried to build in these little quizzes throughout each lecture, so there should be 1 or 2 of them per lecture. They are actually clickable buttons, so you can click on any one of the green boxes, and then depending on whether you have the correct or the incorrect answer, that green box will take you to another PowerPoint slide and either show you that you were correct and tell you why, or tell you that you were incorrect and tell you why you were incorrect. So I would really encourage you, when you are watching these recorded lectures, listening, reading the material on each slide, to take those little quizzes just so that you can have a better understanding of the material that's being presented to you. So as I noted in the slide discussing how much children grow every year, so how much weight they gain and how many pounds they add, we also talked about the fact that children's arms and legs get longer, and this is because they develop what is called epiphyses. So epiphyses are places where cartilage is produced that turns into bone. So you can see in the graphic in the middle of the slide that there are epiphyses at the top and bottom of the long leg bones. So this is where bone growth happens. So first it's cartilage, and then over time it turns into bone. So between 2 and 6, children are gaining a lot of these epiphyses. So they're gaining 45 new epiphyses. So this means that there's a lot of growth in the long bones. This is also part of the reason that when children are younger, especially in elementary school, that they tend to break bones fairly often because they have this cartilage that hasn't completely finished turning into bone yet, and it's easy to break. So children get these long bones that aren't super strong yet, and then they're busy and active and do all kinds of things, and they often end up with broken bones in that elementary school period until that process is complete. Another thing that's happening in terms of physical growth is that the face changes. So if you look at faces of infants and toddlers, they're very round, but they have very narrow jaw structures, so the mouth looks tiny, the jaw looks tiny, and then as children move into, as they're heading towards elementary school, so as they're in that preschool period, early elementary school, the face starts to take on a more adult-like shape, just like the body starts to take on more adult-like proportions, and that jaw widens. And that's because even though those permanent teeth haven't erupted yet, they're coming. They are taking up room in the jaw line, and more space is needed. So that's why the face changes during that particular point in time. And you can see in the graphic at the right that for a 4-year-old, all of those permanent teeth buds are there. They just haven't dropped down into position yet and pushed those baby teeth out. So this slide is just to show you what the basic brain structures are. This is not a biology class, but there are some things that are important for you to understand about the brain and how it's structured so that you can understand what kinds of brain growth is happening during the preschool age period, which we will get to in the next few slides, but just a quick biology lesson on the structures of the brain. So the brain is made up of nerve cells called neurons. You can see the picture on the right. That is a picture of a neuron. So it is a complicated apparatus, and there are lots and lots of them in your brain. So there are two halves. There's the sending half of the neuron and the receiving half of the neuron. And there's a space in between that sending and receiving half called the synapse. So what basically happens is the neuron is carrying those synapses forward, so across the axon, and then releasing chemicals that get picked up by the receiving neuron. Those are called neurotransmitters, and then that goes down to the dendrite. So we have the sending neuron sending an electrical signal along the axon. That electrical signal is transformed into a chemical signal called a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter is released across the synapse, and then that electrical charge continues on down to the dendrite, where it is picked up by the next sending neuron. And that is how information travels around the brain. So in addition to synaptogenesis, or the creation of neural connections, another aspect of brain growth that takes place in early childhood and actually across the entire developmental period, even into the early 20s, is called myelination. So myelination is related to the axon. So earlier we talked about the sending neuron and the receiving neuron. And the sending neuron, that electrical signal traveled through the axon. So to help that electrical signal get where it needs to go, there is a layer of fat that covers the axon, and this is called the myelin sheath. So if you think about wires in your house aren't just the metal wire, they're generally covered with some sort of rubbery substance. Generally it's some sort of color, so it helps you know that those are wires. And that is to keep those electrical signals in so that they don't escape out of the wire and go into your walls or into you or into various other things. We want the electrical signal to get from point A to point B through that wire and not get away as it goes across. And that's what the myelin sheath does. It helps those electrical signals to move from neuron to neuron without escaping. So when babies are born, they don't have this myelin sheath. So they don't have this layer of fat, and that's why they don't process things very effectively, because those electrical charges are they're running away along the process of transmitting information. So babies tend to process very slowly, their movements tend to be very jerky, because this myelin sheath hasn't been created yet. So over the process of early childhood and all the way into your 20s, different parts of the brain are developing these myelin sheaths to cover these axons so that information can move around more quickly and do a better job. So I would encourage you to watch the video that's on this slide. It will help you to understand better what the myelin sheath is and what it does. I also wanted to say that when we're talking about synaptogenesis or neural connections, that is creating gray matter in our brains. When we're talking about myelin sheaths, that's the white matter. So when we talk about gray matter and white matter, that is what someone would be referring to. So because you have pretty much all the neural connections that you're ever going to have when you're born, and then those slowly start to get pruned away, so over the process of early childhood, we're losing gray matter, but the brain continues to grow. So the way that the brain continues to grow in terms of weight and in terms of size is through the development of this myelin sheath. So we're not adding any more gray matter, but across time we are adding more white matter. So you can see that the addition of myelin is the primary source of brain growth during early childhood. So between the process of myelination and the synaptogenesis, which happened earlier on in our lives before the preschool period, that's why by the time you are 5 years old, your brain is 90% of its adult size. So that is a very large brain. That's why when people say the first 5 years, that's why they're saying that, because what happens during those first 5 years, so much brain growth is happening. We don't want to miss that window. We don't want to do anything that would screw that up. So just kind of a fun fact, this is why preschoolers can't do sit-ups. It's not because their bodies aren't strong enough. They have nice, strong little bodies and nice, strong little bellies, but they have ridiculously enormous heads for their size, and they cannot lift them off the ground. Once they get a little bit older, then they will be able to navigate that skill. Another factor in brain growth is hemispheric development. So we have two sides to our brain. They are connected in the middle by something called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what sends information back and forth between each hemisphere of the brain. But we know from child development that hemispheric development is uneven. So the left tends to grow first, where language development housed, and then the right grows later, where spatial skills are housed. So this is why around the age of 2, we do see children exhibiting dominant handedness. So because we're getting to the point where those skills, those spatial skills, those motor skills are housed. And whatever your dominant hemisphere is, because we have different dominant hemispheres, so development is uneven, but generally by the end of it you have one hemisphere that's more dominant than the other, and that can help determine what handedness you have. So if you are left brain dominant, you are likely to be right-handed, and if you are either right or left brain dominant, then you could be left-handed. So only about 10% of kids end up to be left-handed, but by about age 2 you should be able to see handedness as set. So it should be fairly obvious once kids are about age 2 what hand they prefer using. So I wanted to finish up the brain growth section by just talking about when we expect certain things to happen. So as I said, that process of myelination happens across child development, again into your early 20s. So the part of the brain, the neocortex that's responsible for rational thought and really thinking things through, doesn't finish completion until you're in your early 20s. But there are several things that come online and experience great amounts of myelination when children are young. So one of them is the cerebellum, which is responsible for balance and body control. At about age 4, myelination is complete in this part of the brain, which is why around age 4 you see children exhibiting so much better balance, and they're so much better at controlling their bodies. They're starting to be able to do more fun movements like balancing across a balance beam and jumping and skipping and all kinds of fun stuff. That's because that part of the brain is just about done at that point in time. So there's also something called reticular formation. So this begins myelinating in early childhood but doesn't finish until adolescence. So this controls how your alertness, being able to pay attention. So if you think about young children, they're not particularly good at this, but they get better and better across childhood. That's because that myelination is happening across childhood. The corpus callosum, that was those fibers that connect the two hemispheres. Those myelinate between age 1 and 4. Makes that child a more efficient thinker because then the right and left half of the brains are able to talk to each other and do their work together rather than working so much in isolation. And then also we see that in the preschool period, there is the beginning of myelination in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. But again, this is something that's going to continue across the early childhood period, again into the early 20s. And that is why kids are continuing to work on their memory. They're continuing to be able to see other people's points of view and to engage in kind of that rational, planful thinking that young children aren't particularly good at, because that's beginning, but it's not finished until much later on.
In each of the developmental domain lectures, we're going to include developmental milestones for the different ages that we're focusing on in this class. So we are focusing on 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and 8-year-olds. You'll notice on these slides that for children age 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'm also going to be including how many months old those children are. So when we're talking about children 5 and under, we either use their age or we use the number of months that they are. Typically, once children get to age 6 and above, we stop talking about how many months old they are and we just use their age. That's why you'll see a difference there. So when we do these milestone slides, and again, we'll be seeing these kinds of slides in our lectures on the different developmental domains. So physical development, emotional development, creative, cognitive, all the different developmental domains will have milestone slides. You may also see these milestone slides pop up in some of our later lectures as well. But when we do these, this information comes from somewhere. So generally, the information is coming from 3 documents that I'm going to share with you in the next few slides. So in about 3 slides from now, you're going to see where I have gotten most of this information from. So the state of California has developed guidelines for thinking about what young children can do or should be able to do at various ages. And so in the state of California, the document that includes 2- and 3-year-olds is the California Infant Toddler Learning Foundations. And again, I'll give you that link here shortly. It's also got information in another document about 4- and 5-year-olds. That is the pre-K or TK, so preschool and transitional kindergarten learning foundations. And then for children who are age 6 and above, that would be the Common Core Standards, which is what elementary school teachers, children, kindergarten and above, use to think about what children should know at those various ages. So if you work in programs, and this would be infant toddler, preschool, or elementary school age programs that receive state, private schools, but schools that receive state funding, there is an expectation that you use these documents to inform your teaching. So that's why I try as much as possible to pull developmental information from these documents so that you have some familiarity with what's expected that you're going to know if you end up teaching or working with young children in one of those settings. So another thing to note is that I won't always give a lot of explanation for what these milestones are. Some of them are self-explanatory, so if we look at this slide, I think it's fairly self-explanatory that when children are 2, they can stand on 1 foot. They can either do this on their own or with support. So if it's a milestone like that, I'm probably not going to explain it. I'll generally just explain milestones that I think that you may not understand just from reading it. But please, if there's ever a milestone that I didn't explain and you're not sure what it means, please reach out because I'm happy to give more information. I'm just trying not to overburden you with too much explanation about each. So a couple things to point out on this slide that might not be as obvious. So if you notice for our age 4 and 5-year-olds that they look very similar, that the descriptions don't change very much, and that's because typically between age 4 and 5, we don't see a lot of dramatic increases or changes in the skills that children are showing. A lot of times it's better, which is why a lot of times for the age 5 milestones, you'll see the word increasing, and then some of the same 4-year-olds, because often 5-year-olds are just getting better. Another thing to notice here is that when we are looking at children who are older, so 6, 7, and 8-year-olds, if you'll notice, we don't have any information on this slide or any other slide in this lecture about 6, 7, and 8-year-olds, because typically the balance skills that are acquired by age 5 just continue to improve, and they improve in ways so they're not getting dramatically new skills, they're just getting better at the skills they already have so that they're able to play sports and dance and ride a bike and do all the cool stuff that elementary school age children can do. Sometimes we'll see specific milestones for 6, 7, and 8-year-olds that are different than age 2 to 5, but not on this particular slide.
In addition to balance and coordination, there are two other aspects of motor development. There's fine motor development and gross motor development. So we'll talk about fine motor development on this slide and gross motor development on the next slide. So fine motor development is small muscle movements. So this is typically when we're thinking about hands and fingers and wrists. Sometimes we can also think about feet and toes and ankles. And then gross motor movement would be larger movements like the leg movement, arm movement, etc. So as you can see, by about 3, children should be able to use their fingers and wrists and hands in concert with each other to be able to manipulate things. So for example, they can eat with a fork, they can hold the fork in their hand, stab the food, twist their wrist, put the food up to their mouth, and then bring it back down to pick up another piece of food. They may have to use one hand to stabilize an object while manipulating something. I mean, we do this as well, right? I have to hold my phone in one hand while I punch the buttons on it with the other to make sure that I have it stabilized. So when we're thinking about 48 and 60 months, one thing that I wanted to note for you is when we talk about gross and fine motor manipulative skills. I think this sounds confusing because why do we have something about gross motor when we're talking about fine motor? But I want you to think about some of the gross motor activities that we do and how they do require fine motor skill. So if I'm throwing, not only am I using my arm, but I'm also using my hand and my wrist, and I've got to adjust those things to be able to get the ball to go the direction that I want it to go. Same if I'm kicking a ball, I'm also using my feet and I'm using my ankles in addition to my leg. And then there's the more traditional fine motor manipulative skills like I was just talking about. So brushing your hair, brushing your teeth, buttoning up a jacket, zipping a zipper, all of those kinds of things. And then again, you can see at 60 months, we're just talking about increasing those 4-year-old skills.
One thing to note on this slide is that these milestones are not taken from the Common Core standard. I was saying earlier that the Common Core standards are developmental milestones for children in kindergarten and above, but the Common Core standards only focus on science, social studies, math, language arts, which would be reading and writing. They don't focus really on the developmental domains. They focus more on academic subjects or disciplines, so they don't have any information about motor development. They don't have information about social, emotional development, creative development. So for some of our lectures, I'm not able to use the Common Core standards to pull information. So if I'm pulling information from a source other than the Common Core standards, I will always put that on the slide. So you can see down at the bottom of this slide that there's a link to typical developmental milestones for grade schoolers. That's where I got this fine motor development information. So it just depends on what developmental domain we're talking about, whether you're going to get information from the Common Core standards or some other resource. And I'll always make sure to let you know where I'm pulling things from. I think for the most part, the milestones on this slide are pretty easy to understand. You can see a lot of it is school-related skills or self-help related skills. Children's fine motor skills are such that in elementary school that they are able to do a lot more things independently and are ready for a lot more of the tasks that are important to being in the traditional K through 12 school system.
In terms of gross motor, we see a lot of things happening during the preschool period. So a child who learned to walk at age 1 and was struggling to go up and down the stairs is now able to do all kinds of amazing things in terms of gross motor development. So a 3-year-old should be able to both walk and run with skill. They should be able to change speeds, and they should be able to be going forward and then turn around and go a different direction, or turn to the left or turn to the right. They tend to jump with both feet at the same time, so they are not jumping on one foot or alternating feet, but both feet planted on the ground and then jumping up and down. A 4-year-old runs with kind of a short stride. Their feet aren't very far off the ground. I always laugh. This is kind of how I run when I do. I run with a short stride and my feet don't get very far off the ground. If you watch the YouTube video that I've included, it's a great view of seeing how stride changes. So you can see that 5-year-olds run with a longer stride, that their feet are off the ground more. So you can see kind of the change in that if you watch that video. Not only are they jumping up and down, but they now should be able to jump for height, see how high they can get with their jumping, and then see how far they can jump. They're trying out all different kinds of fun locomotor skills. So a locomotor skill is going from point A to point B. It's the different ways that we can move our body to get from place to place. So we can gallop and slide and hop and leap. And then you can see at 60 months, better ability to jump for height and distance, and increased ability and coordination in using those locomotor skills.
As noted on the previous slides, here is where you can find developmental milestone information that the state has developed. So again, if you're working with young children, birth through 8 in public school settings or state-supported, state-paid-for settings, you will be expected to know and use these milestones as part of your teaching and part of your assessment of children. So if you're working with children age 0 to 3, you can find those milestones at the Infant Toddler Learning Foundation's document. They have milestones for 18-month-old children and 36-month-old children. So when I'm giving you 24-month-old milestones, I'm actually using the 18-month because that document doesn't have 24 months specifically. So just to let you know that. You can find milestones for 4 and 5-year-olds in the preschool, transitional kindergarten, or PK/TK learning foundations, which you can find that link on this slide. And then if you are teaching elementary school age children, kindergarten and above, you can find that information in those Common Core standards. So again, just a reminder, the infant and toddler learning foundations do have milestones. They don't tend to focus on academic topics like math and reading because little small children don't do that. They focus exclusively on developmental domains like cognitive and creative. The PK/TK learning foundations, they're kind of a mix. They have developmental domain information like emotional and physical, but then they also have some information related to the academic disciplines like reading and writing and mathematics. So numeracy kinds of things, and then the Common Core standards do not focus on developmental domains. They exclusively focus on academic disciplines like reading and writing and math and science.
On the remaining slides, we're going to talk about some things that impact how well children are able to grow and their health across the preschool period. There's a lot that can impact healthy growth and development, so we'll take a look at some of these on the next few slides. So one is heredity and hormones. So it's not too important that you know the exact hormones that are responsible, but there are two main hormones that are important. So there's growth hormone, which is present from the moment that we're born and influences basically all of the growth that we're going to engage in as a human person. So the only thing it's not responsible for is the central nervous system and the genitals. So very important for our bodies to have and make that particular hormone. It accounts for a lot. There's also thyroid stimulating hormone. And so this is another hormone that's important. It's released for normal development of the nerve cells and for body size. So that's another important one. The one I really want you to pay attention to is that growth hormone, and that is primarily because it's really important for children to sleep, because our bodies release that growth hormone when we're sleeping. So if children aren't getting enough time to sleep, then their bodies aren't getting the opportunity to make as much growth hormone as they need to be able to grow healthy and well. So if you've ever heard a child say that they hurt, that parts of their body are achy when they're sleeping, this is probably 100% true, because not only do our bodies produce growth hormone while we're sleeping, but we actually grow while we're sleeping. So if you have heard expressions like, you grew a foot overnight, it's probably, a bit of a stretch to say that you grew a whole foot, but we definitely do grow when we're sleeping. So we want to make sure that children get enough sleep. So we've got a couple issues there. One is that we have a culture that does not respect sleep. We don't sleep enough ourselves. We don't give our children enough time to sleep. They should be sleeping like 12 to 14 hours a day when they're in preschool, so they should take a nap. They should sleep well at night. And if you are cutting that short, then children are going to, one, be cranky, but two, they're not going to be able to grow in the way that they need to. We also spend too much time on screens, even very young children. And those screens, that blue light interferes with our circadian rhythms. It interferes with our ability to sleep well, and then that can also interfere with sleep. And then some children, about half, have sleep difficulty. So they wake up and have nightmares. So I would encourage you to watch the little video on this slide. It will tell you more about the sleep difficulties, including parasomnia, that preschoolers experience. And then you can participate in the little quiz. Remember to click on the buttons. Another thing that can impact growth and health is children's emotional well-being. So unfortunately, when children experience stress that's not normal, so when they experience stressful traumatic events over a long period of time, there's no break in those stressful events, there's no support in managing those stressful things that are happening, children become emotionally overwhelmed, and this is called toxic stress. So when we get to the point where stress is not manageable, not supported, it becomes toxic and it damages our health. So when children are experiencing this kind of toxic stress and trauma, it can lower production of growth hormone. So in addition to being bad for our brains and other parts of our bodies, it's actually bad just in terms of us growing and getting to the size that we are supposed to be. It's called deprivation dwarfism. So when your life circumstances are so stressful and so traumatic that your body stops producing growth hormone, that's pretty stressful and traumatic. So we also know that these kinds of stressors, this kind of toxic stress, this trauma is also detrimental to all kinds of developmental outcomes. So you may have heard of ACEs. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. So they are these toxic stress, traumatic kinds of events. And there's a little quiz that you can take to determine how many. So in the quiz, there are 10 different adverse childhood experiences that are known to affect children developmentally. You can take the little quiz. You can see how many ACEs you've experienced in your own childhood. And we know that when people have experienced 4 or more ACEs when they're children, that they have significantly reduced positive developmental outcomes. So they're more likely to have mental health issues, they're more likely to have physical health issues, they're more likely to die earlier on, they don't do as well educationally, so all kinds of, I really want to emphasize that it's not just physical health, that is part of it, but it's also can damage other developmental domains as well. It's also very important for preschoolers to eat well. So I would encourage you to take a look at the nutrition guidelines for preschoolers, and there's a lot of really great information at the myplate.gov on children, preschoolers' pickiness and how much they should eat of different kinds of things. But it's really important to make sure that you're feeding preschoolers appropriately, that they're getting enough protein, that they're not getting too many fats, that they're getting enough fruits and vegetables and grains and all of those kinds of things. So don't be surprised though if it's difficult to feed preschoolers, because they are wary at the beginning of life. They are sort of biased to be nervous about new things. So you want to introduce things slowly, encourage preschoolers to take little nibbles of things. Important to offer a lot of variety early on. So if you only feed children a very limited number of foods and types of foods early on in life, don't be surprised if that's the kinds of foods they like later, because they didn't get trained early in life to like a variety of things. So you may have to step out of your own comfort zone and eat things that you're not entirely sure about to make sure that your preschoolers are willing to eat those things as well. Another tip is to try not to make mealtime stressful. As long as you're offering all healthy food, it really doesn't matter which one of those healthy foods that children choose. If they don't feel like eating vegetables for that day, chances are they'll eat vegetables the next day. So just try to offer all healthy things, and then just use the rest of the meal time to socialize. Also not a good idea to force children to eat everything on their plate. Instead, help them to learn how to eat until they're full. When we force children to overeat, those become bad habits that unfortunately are hard to get rid of and eliminate later on. The final factors that I wanted to discuss that can affect children's growth and health are physical activity and childhood injuries. So in terms of physical activity, it's really important to help children to get plenty of physical activity. Children should have around 60 minutes per day of vigorous physical activity, which means they need to get up and move around and get outside and do things. Far too many children sit and are staring at screens, and particularly in the last year haven't had the opportunity to get out as much as they need to. We definitely know that when children lack physical activity, that it can lead to obesity, and then it can set them up for a lifetime of not being physically healthy and not being as active as they need to. So your textbook does talk about some ideas for how to get children up and moving, things that they should and can be doing. So as I noted in the second bullet under physical activity, the text recommends exposing children to perceptual motor, sensory, and fine motor activities. So you can find more information about this in your text on pages 220 to 225. It will give you definitions and ideas for activities related to those different kinds of activity types. And then the last thing to talk about is childhood injuries. So this doesn't mean that you want to wrap children in a bubble and never let them go outside and try things and do things and be physically active. There's always some risk in physical activity. So we're not talking about preventing every boo-boo or even, necessarily a broken bone. Those are kind of rites of passage in childhood, but we do want to help children to be safe in that they're not sustaining life-threatening injuries. So it's okay to be a little bit risky, but we want to make sure that children are still safe as they do these things. So we do know that boys tend to sustain more and greater injuries than do girls. So that's just something to sort of keep in the back of your mind and keep an eye on. As busy as both my kids were, it really was my son that I would turn my back and he'd be doing a flip off of some wall or something dangerous, which generally my daughter was not doing those kinds of things. He was just much more of a risk taker than she was and much more likely to get injured. Temperament can also affect injury rates. So children who are more difficult are also sometimes more impulsive. They are more active. So you might want to keep an eye on those children who are less temperamentally fearful. So they are more likely to try new things and do things away from kind of where you are. So that's a child to keep an eye on. And then we also, as educators who work with children and families, we need to help to educate parents to make sure that when children are living in poverty or perhaps their parents have lower education levels, that we make sure to help parents understand these kinds of things so that they can provide safe environments for their children. So it's not that parents don't love their children or don't want to do the best by them, but they may not know about safety considerations or ways in which they can keep their children safer. They may not know as much about healthy foods. We have a lot of information about this and it may seem like common sense to us, but these kinds of things aren't common sense to everyone. I'm just going to throw some things out there that you may or may not know. Children can choke on a grape if it's not cut properly. They can drown in less than an inch of water when they are babies, including water that's in the toilet. So these are the kinds of things that we may not even know, and then we're expecting families to know things that may be really out of their wheelhouse. So we just need to always be cognizant of what we can do to educate parents and families about these kinds of things.